But this was my first home that my mom painted. It was an outpost, you know, one of the, we're the obstacle to peace in the Middle East, me and my family. And so this was a hilltop, this was a caravan that we lived in, and it was about 10 minutes outside of Hebron at the time, where you're about to go visit. And so it was our first year of marriage. My wife and I were never into all the material stuff that most the Western world is absolutely fascinated with. And we said our dream would be to live with barely any possessions in a caravan on a hilltop next to Hebron. So the first year we had...
And look what happened to you.
and so that was our first year. And then we lived in Efrat, which is right across the street here. My wife's parents have a house there, and they have a little, you know, unit apartment kind of attached to their house. So we lived there for about 3 years while this place was being built. And then we moved here 5 years ago. And there's just a couple of things about the Jewish home that I wanted to point out. So first I'll point out the thing that is in every Jewish home, or there should be in every Jewish home. So you see above my bookshelf there at the top, the square that's there. So it's, I remember when we first moved in here and we painted the walls, so I immediately got out one of my army knives and I started chipping away at the wall. And I had a guest over here and they thought that I had absolutely gone mad. They said, "Jen, what on earth are you doing?" And so it's a tradition in every Jewish home, based in fact on the prophecy in the book of Haggai, that how could our home be complete when God's home is in ruins? So every Jewish home leaves a section of their home incomplete for the day that God's temple is complete. And so that's a constant reminder as we sit here on Shabbat and we sit here and we always have that big gaping hole in our wall, reminding us that yes, we have a beautiful home and we're so happy to live in Judea and this is, you know, a dream of all dreams, but our home can never be complete without Hashem's home being complete. This painting here is pretty interesting. It was painted by memory by my mom in 1970. And those of you that have been at the Kotel know that on the left side, there are these two little tunnels that you can actually go into. And they're pretty deep tunnels. You can really go pretty far into it. And there are, you know, areas to pray in there. And my mom painted that before those tunnels were discovered. So when she painted that in memory in Atlanta, Georgia, they just weren't there yet. So it sort of goes back. And this is, yeah. So it was always my family's dream, of course, to return to Israel. This is something I put here for you guys to know. This is even more interesting. You guys can pass this around. But this was Shabbat candlesticks that were passed down from my wife's great-grandmother. And she was born in a shtetl in Poland. You know, like a little Jewish, you know, it's not even a town, it's like a little shtetl. That's the only word for it. You know, maybe 20 families lived there. And every Friday night, you know, she would light Shabbat candles with this. And you see the Jewish star in the middle. That's really what I wanted to point out. That in the middle of the Jewish star, it says Zion, Zion. And so you just imagine that, you know, she was in the shtetl in Poland in the 1800s. That's okay.
The other one.
The other one.
They're just cups that sit in it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, those aren't important. They just fit right in.
The other side. The other side.
I see, yes.
Yeah.
Make sure we don't drop it here.
But the reason why I love lighting Shabbat candles with that so much, you know, other than, you know, obviously the chain of the Jewish people that we are continuing, but in the 1800s, for the Jewish people to look at that star and say Zion, and that was on their mind, the chances of that time in the 1800s for the Jewish people to somehow return to Zion was unfathomable. How would they have gotten from the shtetl in Poland, being persecuted and run off by the pogroms and God knows what else they had to live through? How would they have ever made it to Zion? It's just an impossibility. And here we are now lighting her Shabbat candles in the mountains of Judea. Looking at the same Jewish star with Zion on it, but here we are living her every Friday night prayers. We're able to light her Shabbat candles, living out her dreams. So that's really what life in Israel is about. You know, as people get so lost sometimes in all of the political jargon and all the 67 borders and this borders and this UN resolutions, and confuses the hell out of everyone. But the real purpose of us being here is that the Jewish people had a dream. And we were given a vision by the prophets of Israel that one day we would make it home to these mountains. And
You just imagine the feelings of what they had when they came back into the land. I mean, just, about 10 years ago, we were able to go to Europe with our son and daughter-in-law. And we drove into Hungary. That's where my grandparents were from. And I'd never been there before, but just driving into that country, it gave me such a connection and feeling. I can't explain it. Can't explain it.
And you know what it took for us to get ready and fly there, and what it took for them to leave there and sneak
Cross the ocean.
across the ocean. She was pregnant, had a baby, lost her husband just a few months after they arrived in the States even, you know what I mean? And just for the Jewish people, I mean, it just helps us to
Understand?
just
A little
begin
bit,
to
a little bit,
understand just a little tiny bit of what it must be for them to come back home
right,
and what they go through to get back home.
it's, yes.
Just for the sake of the video, tell us where we are, what your name is, what the day is, and who you're talking to.
Okay.
He's the reporter.
So this is Jeremy Gimpel. We're sitting in my living room in the mountains of Judea, in a community called Neve Daniel. I snagged the group on their way to Hebron. I said, you're going to Hebron, it's right on the way. You just make a right turn and you can stop by. I'll have baked goods and juice for you. I said, baked good and the juice, we're coming.
Thank you.
haven't gone more than 2 hours.
And so we're just sitting and schmoozing and just talking about life in my home and sort of, my family's connection to here and my wife's connection to here. And the fact that we now have, these 3, and hopefully a growing family, with 3 homegrown Israeli gems. It's totally unbelievable. And, it seems as though, the way that I understand prophecy in Tanakh, and Ari and I are literally right now working on a video to give this exact teaching over, so you'll be the first in the world to hear it. But that the world works in cycles. And there's a return to Israel, an exile from Israel, and a return to Israel, and an exile from Israel. And very often the words of the prophets have opportunities of coming to pass. But after the destruction of the first temple, the Jewish people faced 2 empires that sought their destruction. The first one was the Babylonian Empire. And Nebuchadnezzar, and he literally destroyed the temple, killed 100,000 Jews, exiled the rest that survived. And after Babylon came Persia. And, Babylon in modern day is Iraq, and Persia in modern day is Iran. And we look at now what the whole world is focused on is the nuclear bombs that Iran is possessing. As Haman wanted to wipe out all men and children, women in one day, how do you do that in one day nowadays? You drop a nuclear bomb, and that really is his plan. What I find remarkable is that the last time Israel was faced with a nuclear threat was in modern-day Babylon. In 1981, Saddam Hussein was building the Osirak reactor with the same mission. He declared himself as a reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar, and he rebuilt the city of Ur. And instead of inscribing the bricks with Nebuchadnezzar's name like he did, he put Saddam Hussein's name. And he lived this vision of, he went on a campaign of terror and conquer in Kuwait and Iran, and his ultimate vision was to recapture Jerusalem. And here we overcame Babylon, and now we're facing Persia. And in the times of Tanakh, in the times of Ezekiel and Isaiah, and more Zechariah, Malachi, and Haggai, it was exactly after overcoming Persia that the prophets of Israel said, there's a window of opportunity now to return to Israel, to return to God, to build a temple. And that window of opportunity lasted. And in fact, the Jews built a temple right after they overcame the Persian threat. And you can't wonder, but perhaps we're now entering into that window of opportunity right after Babylon and Persia, Iraq and Iran. A window of opportunity is now opening for the world, where there really could be a potential for a mass return to the land of Israel, an ingathering of the exiles. And even in those times, in the scroll of Esther, it said, Rabim me'amei ha'aretz mit yahadim, that many from the nations became more affiliated with Judaism. They started to become identified more with Judaism than they did with the cultures that they came from. And so how can we not see this process happening today? That, here we have the Fellowship Baptist Church, and they're not spending their times in the Catholic cathedrals, they're going to Hebron, and they're spending their time in Samaria, and they're spending their time in biblical Israel. How can they not see that they are in fact Mityahadim? They are in fact becoming closer and closer to their Jewish roots, to the identity of the Jewish people. And so, to me, it is a sign of the time that we had those prophecies that were written then for our generation, as we're now facing the last sort of, Persian, Iranian threat. A window of opportunity, I believe, will open, and it's ours to grasp. And as we failed last time, we won't let it happen this time. We're never leaving these mountains of Judea and the mountains of Samaria. This is it. We've been brought home and we're never leaving. So I just want to bless you all that you continue on this beautiful mission, and how you're the shining light of, for all the world to see that it's possible to really be connected in such an intimate, real, authentic way, not in just financial support, but in real relationships.
Well, you're a blessing to us.
Oh, thank you.
Notice that Jeremy didn't say spending time in stores.
Thank you for that. Well, you gotta support the Jewish economy.
Economy.
Yeah, but she's been supporting the Jewish economy a lot. I don't need it.
Every time I come to Florida, the fellowship always takes me in, takes Ari in, and treats us like absolute family. So it's just my pleasure to have you in my home and to return the kindness and treat you like my family. It's just an absolute pleasure for me.
Appreciate it.
Any questions for Jeremy? I know there must be a million. You said you're working on a new video dealing with prophecy.
Yeah, well, I'm working now, in my mind, we always have to be flexible and open to what is, what's happening in the world today, and what is the authentic, Jewish, biblical-based message that the world needs to hear. That's how we sort of feel our messages. As the foreign ministry is talking about nonsense, we would say like, well, what would God want us to say? What would God want the world to hear? And so we're now creating a series of 4 videos that are all dealing with Israel and Iran and the rest of the world. And so some of them are very spiritual and prophetic, some of them are more practical, some of them are just about the right of the Jewish people to defend themselves from those that seek to destroy us. And so we're in the midst of creating a series of 4 videos, because it seems like this is the challenge of our times. Will we have the courage and the faith to do what needs to be done? Will America have the courage and faith to do what it needs to do? And so it seems like Israel is being sent off on its own to defend the world. And if that's our mission, we'll do it. But the world needs to be educated. There is so much ignorance.
Abraham was given that promise by Shem, and through you all the nations of the world will be blessed. And there are many ways you can see that, and many ways to look at it. And even though the nations of the world will continue to reject Israel to a certain point, the blessing of protection in this case is part of that blessing, regardless of how most of the nations see.
We'll receive it. That's a fair.
Ultimately, in retrospect, at some point in the future, the nations will appreciate and will understand the fulfillment of that blessing from you.
Yeah, and you understand the right to the land. I mean, it's just your land, and God gave it to you, and you shouldn't be giving it up. That's.
But this is a critical message, and I need to find the sources of this in Scripture, but this is definitely a rabbinic teaching that's passed down. That there is an absolute difference between the Jewish people that return to Israel now and the Jewish people that return to Israel when the Messiah comes, when things are all happy, when things are all great in the distant future. There's an absolute distinct difference between them. There's also a distinct difference between the non-Jews who attach themselves to Israel now and the non-Jews that say, well, Israel's winning, let's join the bandwagon.
Yes.
And there's a distinctive, absolute difference between both of those categories. And it's almost like there'll be, there's some that talk about how the Jews possibly in Israel will be able to levitate and be able to stand up. People will be able to see them and wow, these were such holy Jews, that they're given the ability to really show their difference. And then the ones that kind of came afterwards and didn't have the faith and didn't have the faith in action to move now, they'll be known. They'll know who were the real deal and who were not. Because, when the Jewish people are on top, and there's a king in Israel, and there's peace around the world, and Israel is the center of the world, then all nations will want to join Israel and stand alongside us. But there will be an absolute difference of those
Yes.
people and you people.
There's a wonderful prophecy in Isaiah 56. You probably know it, where it talks about my house being a house of prayer for all the nations. But prior to that, there are probably 6 verses that deals with people of the nations who observe, who would hold dear God's Shabbat and join themselves to Israel by celebrating the Shabbat, by honoring the God of Israel. And it says there that they would be officers in his court, having a position better than even sons and daughters. And so I would like to think that Isaiah 56 relates to people like us. And there are many of us in the nations. And as Jeremy referred to what will ultimately happen with, I believe, with Iran, Persia, as that is fulfilled and carried out, more and more people of the nations are going to be exactly where we are, coming to Judea and Samaria, and going as far as we possibly could to even work in a community. I think that's going to happen. And I think that is a more clearer fulfillment of Isaiah 56. I might be a dreamer, but I'm standing in emunah, standing in faith.
Yeah, and I think what's so beautiful about this community is that it's such an example of humility. There's no pride here, there's no, we're the biggest church in all of Florida, and we're gonna come here, blah, blah. It's just good people doing God's work. And that's always how Israel has been propelled forward. David was, among the sheep. They brought all the fancy brothers, the big brothers, and David wasn't even called in. He was out playing with the sheep, and he was always the most humble and the most simple. And he was the one that was chosen to lead. And so I just see the good people here. And I really believe that you are the modern day Davids as examples of all. Because it doesn't take fancy people, it doesn't take powerful people, it doesn't take politicians, it just takes good people that have faith and that believe in God, and that take their faith and bring it into action. And so, I really believe, and I said this when I was there, that there will be history books written about this community. That when the whole world was turning against Israel. I just got an email today from our Jewish TV network. And they're very connected to all the different studies that are around about the Jewish community. And they said that anti-Semitism in Europe is now at an all-time high, like off the charts high.
No.
They were talking about, Spain, Poland, they spoke about Hungary as well, being like, just have not seen anti-Semitism like this pre-Holocaust. We're going back to like times of old.
Is that because of the rise of the Muslims, or?
I think it's a mix between, the neo-Nazi, real right-wing influence and the Muslim. It's like both these forces coming together that really don't like us.
Together.
Fear, hatred of the stranger,
Yeah.
the Muslims, the Jews.
So it's, as the whole world seems as though they're turning against Israel, those that really have faith in the word of Hashem see that it's all just an illusion, and they're attaching themselves to Israel against all odds. So it's amazing because you will be the examples. There have always been righteous among the nations. If it was Oscar Schindler or Corrie ten Boom, they said, look, if they could have done it, you could have done it. And they were the examples for the rest. And so in future days, you will be those heroes that the world looks to and said, how did they know? How were they able to go to Samaria? They were working, they built up the Kiddunim. Like, who heard of such a thing? And so I believe that you will be examples, and there will be, it will go down in history. There's no question about it.
Well, our prayer is that God will raise up 1,000 more like us, and I believe He is. I believe He is. We're off to Hebron to meet with Rabbi Wallman and to go to Machpelah. Is there a good word of encouragement you can give us about going?
Yes. So, a couple of things about Hebron. First, the Tomb of the Patriarchs is the oldest functioning building in the world. Some people know it, some people don't, but that's pretty remarkable. It's 2,000 years old. It was built in the same time as the Western Wall was built, in fact, by the same architect. And there's no building in the world that is still being functioned, as it's used by the Muslims for their prayer service. For the Jews, I go there every Friday morning and I pray at the sunrise at the Tomb of the Patriarchs. And so it was the beginning. And it's not a reason it's the oldest functioning building in the world, because it reconnects us to the roots. Obviously, it was the first place that was acquired in Israel. It's where Abraham first purchased land in Israel. But not only that, it's where King David first reigned. For 7 years, he reigned in Hebron before moving to Jerusalem. So our entire connection of sovereignty in the land of Israel, our connection to the land of Israel, our acquiring the land of Israel, it all began in Hebron. That's why the oldest building in the world reconnects us all the way back as far as we can go back to the times of the temple. And so when you really reconnect to Hebron, Hebron comes from the word of chaver, which means friend, but it also means chibur, which means to connect. And so Hebron is our connection. And so the two that come here and that don't actually go to Hebron, they're missing the connection. Because now you're connecting all the way back to the root, to the base covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So I bless you that, as the pastor said, that the promise to Abraham was that all families of the earth shall be blessed. So you're now going to Abraham and saying, Abraham, this is the time.
Even the Arabs call Hebron Al-Khalil. Khalil is the friend. It's Abraham.
Anyway, thank you all so much for coming to my home and spending the morning with me.
Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Close.
Appreciate it.